didn't see the song, but I saw Blue, which was a welcome change of pace. It is my really, really great pleasure to introduce someone who doesn't really need an introduction to anyone in this room. However, for the benefit of colleagues joining us in the beyond through the streaming, I will introduce our speaker today, Professor Cheryll Duncan, who is a musicologist specializing in professional music culture in the late 17th and 18th century Britain, specifically, with a particular focus on legal records of the period. Her research has investigated matters ranging from, for example, performance contracts, music copyright, organ building, and concert administration to musicians' lifestyle and self-fashioning. Cheryl's essays have appeared in major journals. There's a very long list here. Suffice it to say, pretty much every major musicological journal that there is, including the likes of Journal of the American Musicological Society, Music and Letters, and has contributed to numerous book chapters, scholarship. Currently, Cheryll is writing a short monograph on the 18th century flautist, composer, and teacher Louis Brano, drawing on a recently discovered equity lawsuit, which explains the unusual genesis of his flute treatise from 1766. Future projects include Giovanni Francesco Tosa, an opera in London, 1748 to 1750, and a study today. So please join me in welcoming Cheryll. Thank you.
Well, hello everybody, and many thanks for coming along this afternoon. It's really nice to see you all here. You've just heard an extract from the one-act opera Pan and Syrinx by John Ernest Galliard, a German-born oboist who settled in England and became a leading composer in London's playhouses. Pan and Syrinx premiered at Lincoln's Inn Fields Theatre in January 1718 and was an instant success. The role of the nymph Syrinx was created for Jane Barbier, the subject of today's presentation. Barbier sang Syrinx again for her Covent Garden debut in 1740, which turned out to be her last public appearance. It was discovering a lawsuit relating to her contract for that season that initially prompted my interest in Barbier and led me to search out other new information. I'll take you through some of the material that I found and demonstrate how legal records and other archives can open up fresh perspectives on the biography of this little known, but she began her career at the Queen's Theatre in 1711, shortly after Handel's arrival in England and when Italian opera was in the ascendant. Her contralto voice and dark good looks made her suitable for male roles. For her stage debut in November 1711, she played King Almansor in a revival of the pasticcio Almeida, when first-night nerves endeared her to the audience. She went on to sing in revivals of Handel's Rinaldo, first as Eustachio and later the title character. Barbier tackled this challenging repertoire when still in her late teens, suggesting that she already possessed a formidable vocal technique. Then in 1717, Barbier joined the company at Lincoln's Inn Fields, but shortly afterwards, according to Sir John Hawkins, she left her parental home and ran off with an admirer who, quote, pretended love to her. This episode gave rise to a famous poem by the essayist and librettist John Hughes, a keen amateur musician who probably knew Barbier personally. This short extract gives an idea of its tone. Gay, scornful, sober, indiscreet, in whom all contradictions meet. Much want of judgment, none of pride. Modish her dress, her hoop full wide. Brown skin, her eyes of sable hue. Angel when pleased, when vexed a shrew. Genteel her motion when she walks. Sweetly she sings, and loudly talks. The reference to her brown skin and sable eyes is intriguing, as in 18th century England, these terms were often used as code for black people or people of dual heritage. There's no known image of Jane, but her striking looks were much remarked upon, and it's certainly possible further embellishment on the vicissitudes of her character. Some 20 years after her death, the St James's Chronicle ran an article entitled The History of Mrs Barbier. Hughes's poem is reprinted in full. Then the anonymous author throws in a few comments about her, quote, haughty airs and lofty behaviour, adding that she was always a princess, and being used to adoration when she was young, beautiful and successful, she knew not in her advanced years to drop her pretensions to royalty, and subjected herself not only to censure, but ridicule. The main areas of new information are Barbier's family background, year of birth and elopement, her financial activities, Daniel and Martha Barbier. They were among some 50,000 Huguenots who fled to Britain to escape religious persecution in the years following the 1685 Edict of Fontainebleau in 1713. The accepted by the Lords Justices and Judges to whom it had been referred, but it never came to fruition as Stephen died in December that same year. His death was probably sudden, as he left no will, and letters of administration were granted to his widow, Margaret, in January 1720. Margaret Barbier, Jane's mother, was buried at St Margaret's, Westminster on the 9th of February 1737. Her death notice in the Country magazine correctly described her as, quote, Mrs Barbier, mother of the famous singer. Other reports, however, confused mother for daughter. In the Daily Advertiser, for instance, we have, quote, Mrs Barbier, who formerly was a noted singer in the operas. And William Musgrave's obituary repeats the error by listing her as Barbier, Mrs, cantatrix, an opera singer. The confusion probably arose because both women were known as Mrs Barbier. Furthermore, there's a gap in Jane's record after May 1734, and her absence from the stage may have prompted rumours that she had fallen ill and died. I suspect it was Margaret who became ill, and Jane put her career on hold in order to look after her. Margaret Barbier's will was proved on the 8th of February 1737. She bequeathed to Jane 1 shilling and a ring of the value of 1 guinea. The remainder of the estate went to her son. Jane had 2 siblings. A lawsuit alerted me to the existence of a sister, Maria, alias Molly, who died in childhood. Molly was goddaughter of the Honourable Lewis Shirley, who bequeathed her £50. When Lewis died, Molly herself died in 1711, and 5 years later Stephen sued out an action against Lord Ferrers in order to recover the £50. Nothing more is known about little Molly, but the Barbiers' association with the Shirley family demonstrates that they kept company with the more elevated reaches of English society. Jane also had a younger brother, Stephen, who was baptised at St Margaret's, Westminster on the 18th of May 1707. Stephen Jr. evidently followed his father into public office, working his way up the revenue service, which was booming at the time. Press announcements report his various roles in the excise office, where by 1743 he had risen to become a competent general in the London brewery. He died the following year after a brief illness. Now, I'm fairly sure that this Stephen is Jane's brother. There is, however, another possibility, which brings us back to Jane and the story of her elopement. Evidence to vary this episode comes in the form of a marriage allegation dated the 29th of April 1717, which reads as follows: on sex, aged 27 years and a bachelor, and alleged that he intends to marry Jane Barbier of the parish of St Margaret's, Westminster, aged 23 years and a spinster. Now, this so-called common marriage allegation was an alternative to the usual procedure of calling banns, and was expedient for couples who wished to marry quickly, around 1694. Ages given in marriage allegations can be unreliable, but in this case there's circumstantial evidence to support it. In March 1714, a group of singers from the Queen's Theatre petitioned the Vice-Chamberlain to regulate their benefit performances. Jane's father signed on her behalf, presumably because she was under 21 and not legally an adult. Assuming a birth year of 1694, she would indeed have been only 20 years old in 1714. And this ties in with her being 17 when she made her professional debut at the Queen's Theatre. I know that seems really young to us, but it was quite usual at that time. Now, an allegation only states an intention to marry, and Jane and John never actually tied the knot. My interest in John Hamerton was piqued, though. Hamerton lost his fortune in the financial crash of 1720, but he used his connections with the likes of Sir Robert Walpole, Britain's first Prime Minister, to secure advancement. From 1725, he held various public offices in South Carolina, which had been colonised by British settlers some 50 years earlier. By the second quarter of the 18th century, South Carolina was experiencing huge economic growth due to exporting rice. He used his position to secure numerous grants of land. For example, an extract from a colonial plat or map book states that in 1732, the Surveyor General of South Carolina, quote, had measured and laid out unto John Hamerton, Esquire, Secretary, etc., a plantation in Colleton County containing 1,000 acres. This and many other documents relating to Hamerton's activities are preserved in the South Carolina Department of Archives and History. These records are digitised and freely available online. Despite amassing a large estate, though, Hamerton was constantly in debt, and his record in the colony was blighted by appalling impropriety and financial mismanagement. In 1744, he returned to England, where he continued to borrow money, and after spending time in debtor's prison, he died virtually penniless in June 1762. Well, following the episode with Hamerton, Jane returned home and resumed her career. 2 years later, we find an intriguing comment in a letter from John Hughes to Mary, Countess Cooper. Mrs. Barbier's time being so very uncertain, I have engaged another of my musical acquaintance, Mrs. Robinson, who will be proud of the opportunity of waiting on your ladyship tomorrow in the evening. It's difficult to know quite what to make of this, but I wonder whether Jane was having to juggle her professional engagements with other responsibilities at that time. Evidence to support this view is preserved in a manuscript in the Houghton Library at Harvard University. This manuscript is a collection of nightly reports from the doorkeeper or box office keeper of Lincoln's Inn Fields Theatre. So as well as recording the number of seats sold for every performance, it gives names of those in the audience who were admitted free of charge, such as family members of performers. In 1727, there are a number of references to Mrs. Barbier's mother and Mrs. Barbier's brother. Of particular interest, however, are the entries for Mrs. Barbier's son, who attended on the 22nd of April, and Mrs. Barbier and son on the 14th of June. This raises the possibility that the legacy of Jane's relationship with Hamerton was a child. If this was the case, then their little boy would have been about 9 or 10 by this time. And if he was named Stephen after his grandfather and uncle, which is likely, then the records I take to relate to Jane's brother might, in fact, refer to her son. In any case, Jane probably outlived both of them, as no family members are mentioned in her will. Her involvement with Hamerton was of brief duration, and I suspect she was seduced by the man who had promised to marry her. In any event, it's clear that she bore a child and chose to raise him as a single parent while maintaining a demanding theatrical career. This required considerable resilience in an age when having a child outside marriage was stigmatised by society and greatly reduced a woman's future prospects of marriage. And indeed, Jane remained unmarried for the rest of her life. So moving now to her finances. Jane was plaintiff in 2 related lawsuits brought before the Court of King's Bench in Hilary Term 1720. The defendants were Christopher Bullock in the first suit and George Pack in the second. The contents are formulaic and more or less identical, and the image on the slide shows the rotulus relating to Bullock. It's typical of common law documents before about 1731 in its use of heavily abbreviated Latin and a distinctive form of writing known as courthand. So, who were Bullock and Pack, and why did Barbier take them to court? The documents are frustratingly thin on detail, but with a bit of careful contextual work, it's possible to work out what's probably going on. So, just a bit of context here. So, in January 1717, as we've seen, Barbier joined the company at Lincoln's Inn Fields, which was run by John Rich, the leading theatrical entrepreneur and manager of his day. Rich had opened his new Lincoln's Inn Fields Theatre in 1714, where he put on a full repertory of plays enhanced with pantomime afterpieces, combining music, dance, and really spectacular stage effects. However, by 1717, the theatre was struggling financially, with the writer and politician Richard Steele writing to his wife in June that year that Rich was, quote, almost broke. The following September, Rich signed over management of his theatre to 2 experienced actors in the company, Christopher Bullock and Theophilus Keene. Keene died the following July and was replaced as co-manager by George Pack, another actor in the company. But the theatre continued to lose money, and by 1719, the Bullock-Pack partnership was in financial crisis. On the 9th of May 1719, Bullock, doubtless aware that his creditors were closing in, borrowed £240 from Barbier. Now, this was a huge sum. Online currency converters estimate that it was worth between about £28,000 and £45,000 today. Bullock's creditors weren't satisfied, however, and he was arrested on the 22nd of May, but quickly found bail. Press announcements for the performance of Harlequin Hydaspes on the 26th of May explained that it had been, quote, unfortunately prevented on Friday last by the unexpected arrest of the person who was to have played the Doctor. Further down we read that the role of the Doctor was played by Christopher Bullock. Well, in Hilary Term 1720, Barbier took Bullock and Pack to court separately on a plea of debt. On the 5th of February, they acknowledged the action with a cognovit, a mechanism whereby defendants were allowed more time to find the money, but if they failed, then the plaintiff could proceed straight to execution. On the 12th of February, Barbier did indeed obtain judgment, allowing her to recover the money she was owed. The lawsuits don't specify why Barbier made the loan, but I'm sure she did so in an attempt to help shore up the ailing company. Her efforts were not enough to save the day, however, and in May 1720, Bullock and Pack handed back control of the theatre to John Rich. I think two things can be taken from this. Barbier was sufficiently solvent to afford the loan in the first place, and she had the confidence to initiate and pursue her claim through the English legal system. So this is a summary of what we know, or some of what we know about Jane's finances. So the earliest evidence relates to earnings at the Queen's Theatre, where she was paid £300 for the 1712 to 13 season, and she earned an additional £20 for singing in the Duchess of Shrewsbury's private concerts. Barbier's total earnings of £320 equate to something between £33,500 and £55,000 in today's money, a pretty impressive sum for an 18-year-old at the start of her career. Then in 1719, as we've just seen, she loaned £240 to Bullock and Pack. Now, in August 1720, the press announced that, quote, Mrs. Barbier, the famous singer at the new playhouse, having gained above £5,000 by South Sea stock, has sung her last farewell to the stage. £5,000 was a staggering amount, certainly enough to retire on, though I suspect it was wildly exaggerated, if indeed it had any truth at all, fake news being no less common in the 18th century than today. The date is really significant, though. It relates to the South Sea bubble, arguably the most spectacular episode in English financial history. Over several months in 1720, the price of stock in the South Sea Company was artificially inflated, prompting a frenzy of speculation which reached a peak in August, the month that Jane's £5,000 was reported. During that autumn, the stock value fell rapidly and the market crashed. Countless investors, John Hamerton amongst them, lost their money. And scholars have assumed that this must also have happened to Jane, as her advertised retirement was of short duration and she was back on stage within a couple of years. But not every investor lost their money over the course of the bubble, and women investors as a group are known to have fared much better than men. In light of this, and of what we now know about her father's role as a financial advisor, it's possible that Jane managed her money rather more shrewdly than some commentators have imagined. For the 1724 to 25 season at Lincoln's Inn Fields Theatre, Barbier was the highest paid contracted member of the company, receiving a salary of £210. In 1732, she subscribed to the publication of 6 cantatas by Henry Carey, the librettist for 2 English operas in which Barbier sang that year. We don't know the terms of her subscription, but Barbier's engagement in patronage networks suggests that she was financially solvent at this time. And for the 1740 to 41 season, Barbier was contracted to sing at Covent Garden, which brings us to a further piece of new evidence. For her Covent Garden debut on the 16th of December 1740, Barbier played Syrinx in Galliard's opera Pan and Syrinx, performed as an afterpiece to the popular comic play The Country Lasses. The press announcement confirms that this was, quote, the first time of her performing upon that stage. Barbier was probably invited by John Rich, who by now was manager at Covent Garden, because she had created that role to great acclaim back in 1718. Pan and Syrinx was also performed the next evening when presumably she sang again. After that, Barbier disappears from the theatrical records. But as the new evidence shows, her story doesn't end there. In Michaelmas term 1741, Barbier sued John Rich in King's Bench for reneging on their contractual agreement. The plea roll contains considerable detail about the terms of that contract, including information about pay and conditions. By this date, common law documents were written in English, so this document is much easier to read than Barbier versus Bullock and Pack. The key points of their agreement are as follows. Barbier was contracted for the whole season, which would not extend beyond the 20th of June 1741. She was required to sing in operas, masques, etc. as required, having been given adequate time to prepare. She was required to attend all rehearsals and performances unless ill, in which case a proportionable sum would be deducted. She was not permitted to perform elsewhere or in any benefit for another member of the Covent Garden Company without Rich's written consent. She was to be paid £210 in 6 equal instalments of £35 every 6 weeks from the 1st of September 1740. If the theatre closed due to a public calamity, such as the death of the king or the prince or princess, Barbier could choose one entertainment to be performed for her benefit, with which to deduct £40 from the proceeds. And if either party breaks the contract, the other is entitled to £420, that is, twice the contracted salary as a penalty. Well, Barbier complained that she received only the first 2 payments. Rich refused to pay more, thereby breaking his side of the agreement. The entry book of judgment records that Barbier's case was upheld by the court, so she was awarded £420, the penalty for Rich breaking their agreement, and equivalent to something between £50,000 and £70,000 today. Not bad for a couple of nights' work. But why did Rich renege on their contract, especially when he risked taking such an enormous financial hit? Well, the answer to this lies just up the road in the John Rylands Library on Deansgate. Its special collections holds a fragile little diary kept by the actor and prompter Richard Cross. This contains a calendar of productions at Covent Garden and Drury Lane theatres from September 1740 to May 1742, in which Cross records the night's billings, box office takings, and his own reflections on various performances. This diary is of great significance to theatre history, not least because it records working conditions and repertory at the time when the likes of David Garrick and Peg Woffington made their acting debuts. The relevant pages for Barbier are shown on the slide. So on the right opening is a chronological list of performances stating dates, titles of plays and afterpieces performed, and box office takings. The last entry states that on Tuesday the 16th of December, the main play was The Country Lasses, followed by the afterpiece Pan and Syrinx, and takings were £100. On the left opening, Cross adds little annotations for some of the performances, such as never acted there before. For Pan and Syrinx, he makes a particularly revealing comment. Mrs. Barbier sung, hissed. This ties in with an anecdote recounted many years later in The History of Mrs. Barbier, to which I referred earlier. After she had been terribly hissed and exploded, Barbier claimed to Rich that her ill treatment was owing to a party of Miss Chambers's friends. That's the singer Isabella Chambers, Barbier's long-term rival. Rich, who loved an ill-natured sarcasm and mistook rudeness for wit, replied, "Yes, madam, you are in the right. Miss Chambers has a very great party indeed, for I think you was hissed by the whole audience. Well, whatever the reasons for Jane's hostile reception, her Covent Garden debut was clearly a disaster, and Rich lost no time in dropping her from the roster to avoid further reputational damage. He had already paid the first 2 instalments up front, but on account of her poor performance, she was dismissed and received nothing more. Now, Rich had taken something of a risk by contracting Jane in the first place. She hadn't performed in public for several years, and playing the role of a youthful nymph at age 46 might have stretched audience credulity a bit too far. It must have been a humiliating experience, but she wasn't prepared to take it lying down, and her tenacity was well rewarded by the court. So the final document that I'd like to mention is Jane's will, which she made in May 1756, the year before her death. In this revealing and rather touching document, she asks to be buried next to her father and mother at St Margaret's, Westminster, to be interred, quote, in a very decent and genteel manner at 11 o'clock at night. Nighttime funerals were more expensive than those held in the daylight, so they were of higher status. The clergyman, clerk and pallbearers were to wear white gloves, scarves and headbands, and the hearse and horses to have white feathers. And these white accessories were customary for funerals of girls and unmarried women. The total cost of the funeral not to exceed £45, so between about £5,500 and £8,500 today. This is interesting. She specifies precautions to avoid being buried alive. And she says in the will, quote, "My desire is that I shall be kept for 6 days close covered in the bed I shall die in before I am buried, as many have come to life who have been thought dead." She lists several annuities in English and French banking houses. She bequeaths £21 each to her 2 executors. She leaves 50 shillings to every prisoner of Whitechapel Prison to secure their discharge. Whitechapel Prison was specifically a debtor's prison. And she asks that any residue should be distributed amongst the debtors of the Gatehouse Prison, Westminster. Now, locating Jane's will is a fairly straightforward matter, and I'm not the first researcher to have looked at it. The probate records of the Prerogative Court of Canterbury are amongst the largest and most used archives of English and Welsh historical records. They're held in the National Archives and can easily be accessed as a digital image through the National Archives Discovery Catalogue or via genealogical sites such as ancestry.com. This image shows the first part of Jane's will in digital form. Now, you don't need to read it, but I want to explain exactly what this document is and the circumstances of its creation. It's a registered copy will, one of hundreds of thousands of such wills held in the document series Probe 11. These are copies of the original probates written into standard volumes of bound parchment by clerks at the church courts. When Probe 11 was microfilmed many years ago, the aim was to preserve the manuscripts rather than to make the documents more accessible. And there are issues with the poor quality of this microfilm, particularly the grayscale rendering, which fails to capture some details of the original. So things like marginalia and interlineations, for example, can be illegible. Now, in the early 2000s, these Probe 11 microfilms, but not the manuscripts themselves, the microfilms, were digitally scanned and made available on the National Archives website. So, although this greatly improved access, of course the digitised copies replicate all the problems inherent in the microfilm. Furthermore, they were not scanned using the latest high-quality colour digital photography techniques. So we're dealing with a low resolution scan of a poor quality microfilm of the registered copy manuscript. And lack of metadata on the type and quality of the scan leaves researchers with no explanation for the problems they experience with using them. A rather more significant issue is that in copying the original wills, the church clerks replicated their basic content, but material aspects such as formatting, spelling, and handwriting are completely transformed or lost altogether. Such things can reveal a great deal about the testator, such as the circumstances in which they made their final wishes known. So it's well worth checking to see if an original will survives. Original wills are held in a separate document class, Probe 10. This has not been digitised, so you have to visit the National Archives and search through boxes of material in the hope of finding what you're looking for. Happily, Barbier's original will is there, and I suspect I'm the first researcher to have examined it. So here's my photograph of the first page. And Jane testifies that it was, quote, all wrote by my own hand, so it provides a unique example of her handwriting, complete with ink blots and the occasional smudge. The style is literate, and the penmanship is both careful and confident. What I particularly want to draw your attention to, though, are the very curious spellings, which are not evident in the registered copy because the clerk mostly corrected them. I've transcribed a short section to show you the kind of thing I mean. And it's the section that says, I desire that my body, if I die in London, may be buried by my father and mother in the Church of St Margaret's, Westminster, but if I should die at any distance from London, then I desire to be buried wherever I shall die, and to be interred in a very decent and genteel manner at 11 o'clock at night, the clergyman to have white gloves and scarf, ye pallbearers the same, and the clerk to have white gloves and hatband, the feathers of the hearse and horses to be white likewise, and the whole expenses of my funeral not to exceed the sum of £45 of sterling money of Great Britain. Now, of course, spelling wasn't standardised at that time, so it's common enough to find words spelt phonetically, money being written M-U-N-N-Y, for instance. But there are more aberrant spellings than usual, including some very uncommon ones, such as EU in place of U. So buried is spelt B-E-U-R-E-Y-E-D, and funeral F-E-U-N-E-R-A-L-L. To me, this suggests at the very least that Jane spoke with a strong French accent, which isn't surprising in light of what we now know about her family background. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on this, but this document leads me to think that Jane was probably born in France and spent her formative years there. The earliest date we have for the Barbiers being in England is 1704, when Jane would have been about 10. Existing biographies describe her as a native of England or an English contralto, but I suggest that French contralto would probably be more accurate. So, just to summarise the main findings, Jane was born around 1694. Her parents were French Huguenots who emigrated to England to escape religious persecution. Born as a single parent while continuing her demanding career. In 1719, she loaned £240 to Bullock and Pack to support the struggling company at Lincoln's Inn Fields. In 1741, she saw her death show that Barbier avoided the fate of many 18th century women singers who made good money but died destitute. Francesca Cuzzoni, Caterina Galli, evidence adds significantly to existing biographies of Jane Barbier and reframes her story to one of hard work, tenacity, and financial prudence. Thank you. Wow, thank you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for a fascinating paper. So many things I was struck by, and as you say, this wonderful archival digging to put this puzzle together. I think we were saying earlier, I mentioned earlier, I was doing my homework and checking the Groove article on Barbier just before, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there was even a place of birth, certainly no date, and I do remember many question marks around it. So it's this important work that adds to that knowledge. Yeah, what this says about that narrative of actors on the stage at that time, but I wouldn't be doing my job, I think, properly if I didn't open it up to the floor first. Yeah, Michelle.
Gosh, Cheryl, I feel like I've been watching Netflix. I mean, you should absolutely sell the rights. It's just such a fascinating story.
She is interesting, isn't she?
You just tell it so well, and also I think probably we haven't got an accurate impression of just how much of a jigsaw you put together here. Because you tell it, so seamlessly, but it sounds like it's a lot of detective work and a lot of time and a lot of digging and persistence in it. I mean, it's just totally fascinating. I'm absolutely gripped.
Thank you.
I have a very general question, which is, it would just be really nice to hear, in terms of the context, how unusual was it that a woman would, at that time, especially perhaps a woman who wasn't white, would be able to succeed the way she succeeded, and would be able to kind of put herself, to be as capable as she was, because the barriers she must have faced must be huge. Was it the case that opera singers, there were other opera singers that were able to have these opportunities as women, single parents, or does she seem just unique?
I certainly think it's unusual. I mean, there were a number of women actors who had children and continued their career. I think that there's some mention of the singer Julia Frazee having had a child, but I've never fully looked into that. She certainly, there's mention of that in her some of the records. We really don't know whether Jane was a woman of colour, although it's interesting that Guyenne, where her parents were from, back in Tudor times, in fact, had released cargoes of enslaved people and were very welcoming of particularly African people in that province. So it's not impossible that there is some kind of, intermarriage going on there. But we don't know. I mean, I've asked a lot of historians about this. Most of them said that they think that the brown skin, sable eyes suggest strongly that she was probably dual heritage. But I did speak to another scholar who said it could have just been a marker of otherness. And the very fact that she was a French refugee would have been enough to, pick her out as other. But I don't know. I mean, certainly the idea that I get is it would have been less of an obstacle to have been a woman of colour trying to make it on the stage than an unmarried mother. That really was very stigmatised, I think. But I think, the people that I've done work, I don't think I've worked on anybody quite as much as Jane. And I've been surprised how much information there is. I mean, she really was well known in her own time, but I found the lawsuit because I was trying to find lawsuits involving John Rich. And I'm slightly embarrassed to say that at that time I found it, I didn't know who Jane Barbier even was. So she's not that big a name, but I've been trying to put together a whole list of her roles, and it's massive. She really did work incredibly hard. And I think also that shows that she was reasonably well paid as well. It's really hard with currency converters. It is very difficult, but I mean, I get the sense that she was a very well respected singer and in demand, really, and that's why it's so sad that her career ended in that rather ignominious way at Covent Garden. Does that answer that sort of, Michelle?
Thank you, Cheryl.
Hi, John.
Full historical narratives are beautifully about Michelle, about Jane Barbier being a woman of colour, and this is just a speculation, but the poem that you shared that talked about the dark skin and say the lines was called Hue and Crime. I wonder if there's a pun potentially there in the title.
Oh, John, that's an interesting one. I hadn't even thought about that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But just two questions that let's follow up with. First is very sort of simple, pragmatic one really, was how did you know to look in the Rylands library for the material relating to cross?
I knew because there's a very, so the John Rylands used to publish little kind of quarterlies, I think they were. Anna, you might know. Is it the bulletins? Yeah. And ages ago, somebody had written in effect, done a kind of transcription of the manuscript. I mean, this was back probably in the 50s or something like that. Quite how I found that, I can't honestly remember. I think it was probably when I was looking up, Covent Garden Productions. It's one of these sort of things that you can stumble across. And so as part of the transcription, I saw that, we've got this Mrs. Barbier hist. So, that's not, I think, in view of what they say about Isabella Chambers and the rival factions, I don't know quite what the full story was there, but anyway, that's how I came across it.
Thank you. And then is Cheryl's son?
Yes.
Daughter. Do we know anything about what happened to his son?
No, we don't even know what he was called. You see, this is the problem. Those two references are the only things I've ever found. I don't know what to make of the letter to Countess Cooper about her time being so very uncertain. I mean, I think it's suggestive, but it's not. It's not really conclusive. Sorry, John. Just run that.
I was wondering if you hear anything about the son.
Right. So there's only those two mentions. I think he was very likely christened Stephen, but I also think probably because he was born outside marriage, it was fairly usual for perhaps the mother to have been confined outside the home area and the child baptised outside the home area. So there's no mention of any baptisms at St Margaret's, but I think that would be the reason for that. And as I say, the Stephen Barbier, so you've got Stephen Barbier father, Stephen Barbier brother, possibly Stephen Barbier's son. I think it's likely. So the references to the younger Stephen Barbier literally could be either. The dates would fit. So, the person who rose to be the accomptant general at the London Brewery could have been her son, actually. He'd have been youngish for that role, but not too young, I think. So no, nothing. We've got a death date for one Stephen Barbier around that time, but not the other.
Cheryl, that was absolutely brilliant. I didn't realise the actual wills were in a different category in the National Archives, so thank you for that piece of information. Are they indexed?
It took me a long time to twig as well, Anna. The Probe 10, no, not really. They're roughly, contained. Now let me just think. I think they're contained by year and then alphabetically. So it's not too difficult
No.
if you're looking for a specific one.
So if you know from the copied will, then
Yes.
Okay.
But quite often, it's one of those things, that I can see why people don't bother. I think for a long time I thought that the registered copy will was the thing, because they look sort of, old writing and everything. And it took me quite a long time for the penny to dawn that all of these things looked identical, so couldn't possibly be. And it's interesting. I was deeply moved when I read Jane's will. Profoundly moved actually, because of the immediacy of that document in your hand. And knowing, there are 3 codicils, and the last codicil was written just before she died. And it's very touching because she leaves some, forks and knives and spoons and things, tableware, to her dear friend Cassandra Stevens, who was tender to her in her last illness. I was really overcome when I read that. And the handwriting is a little less strong. You can see that, but she wrote it herself. So I think, I mean, I have to say that I don't quite know why I looked. I think I probably had a bit of time to kill at the National Archives and thought I'd give it a go. But you can sort of tell when you open these things up if anybody's looked at them. And I had this feeling, I thought, I don't think anybody's actually seen this. And it's those material, you know, those material things, like the very fact that, you know, it's signed in her own hand, and obviously the registered copy wills aren't signed, there's no seal. Whereas with the original will, you've got the seal and the signature, all her witnesses sign. It's a totally different, you know, material object. And I think by the time you've got the document, and I'm not knocking the Probe 11 documents that you get through Ancestry and stuff, because it's fantastically, it's made all that so accessible. It's wonderful. But I'm genuinely not sure that people realise what it is that they're looking at. I certainly didn't know for a long time. What's quite interesting, and I think it concerns me a bit, is that ever since the Probe 11 was put up online, you can't actually go and look at the original manuscripts.
Right.
So you can't even go and check those out, which is interesting. And I think, if I remember rightly, the National Archives' own website, more or less, it explains about, you know, the originals and the copies. And I think it more or less says, you know, Probe 11 is sufficient for most people's needs. So it slightly puts you off bothering looking for an original. But they're completely different, you know, they're just completely different things. And the whole thing about the spelling, I hope somebody can help me out with what you think about that spelling. You simply wouldn't know that from the copy. The copy just looks perfectly normal. Never pick anything up, but the spelling in this is so, you know, exceptional, really, that I was amazed, because I was very familiar with the registered copy. So this was, yeah, it was quite a revelation.
Who were her executors?
I can't remember. One was called Theobald. I think one was a chemist. I think they were neighbours.
Right,
One was a chemist. No, they weren't musicians. They weren't theatre people. No.
Paying them £45 is quite a substantially generous amount of money.
I mean, one class of record that I do need to get my head round are banking records. Now, as somebody who can't even work out their own bank statements, it's a bit of a scary thing. But I certainly have got some documents. She banked with the Bank of England, and again, they were known as having very safe savings and annuities. And certainly towards the end of her life, she transferred, I think it was £100 from her account to somebody who, I don't know who he was, but some man that she made this transfer to. And I think there could well be other records, but she also had annuities in the townhouse in Paris, which was one of again, the more reliable French banking houses. I mean, I honestly get the feeling that she was very savvy with her money, and yet, just mainly thanks to John Hughes and his poem, you rather get the idea of her being a kind of, you know, flibbity-gibbet and sort of, you know, headstrong and, well, much want of judgment, as he said. But she was, you know, she was comfortably off at her death. And I just found it very touching that, you know, she had no family members. So by and large it was to, you know, imprisoned debtors and so on.
Interesting character in itself, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I do think I think she had great tenacity, and as I say, I mean, the thing about the South Sea stock is interesting. We don't know, and I haven't been able to find anything about her investments at that time. That's not to say that, you know, there isn't anything to be found, but it's interesting how people just assume that she lost her money, so she had to go back and carry on singing. And she might have done, but I don't think we should jump to that, you know, assumption, really, given what we know about the role that her father had, and the fact that she also managed her money quite efficiently, it appears.
Yeah, Cheryl, thanks. Absolutely amazing. My attention was gripped the whole way through, and the quality of questions also. This is
Well, yeah.
Why before that?
Well,
Who fed her? You know.
yes. I mean, that is interesting. I mean, I think she, I think she was well known in London by that time, and there was this kind of. I mean, it was such a weird. That whole period in 1720 was just so weird. It's a really complex story, the South Sea Bubble. I mean, I've read loads about it, and I'm still, it's really complex what was going on. But I think often you just get a kind of summary of it in history books and things, which is a very, very partial story. And, there was lots of sort of hysteria about the number of, suicides and, because people literally lost entire fortunes and so on. But, if you were, that wasn't necessarily the case. Not everybody fell foul of that. We do know that she invested in the Bank of England, and that was known to be safer than some of the other banking opportunities. I ran this past Professor Michael Burden at Oxford, because he's very good on newspapers and things, and he was highly sceptical, and he said he didn't believe a word of it, and he suspected it wasn't anything. I don't know so much. I mean, I think lots of perfectly sensible people did speculate. There were different ways that you could invest your money. You didn't necessarily have to do it in a sort of silly way. And there really is strong evidence about women investors on the whole did pretty well. There's lots of really close research on that. But I think it was all a bit, I don't know. I really don't know. That's all it said. What I read to you is all it says in the papers. And it's surprising how many scholars have jumped on it and commented on it, but all to the effect that, she, silly woman, she invested and lost all the money and had to go back to work. And as I say, I don't know. I think at the very least we should keep an open mind.
Can I jump in?
Please.
Yeah, there is a culture of celebrity lens now, especially around the stage. And as Cheryl was just saying, just because something was printed in the newspaper didn't mean it was true. And I think that the real key to this archival work is to match up what we can find, either said behind the scenes, as it were, or in the press. And sometimes what you see, the stories, there's enough truth between them, but they differ, in the detail. And the people who send these reports in sometimes are the people themselves, not the specific newspapers. The editorial practices were not nearly as stringent as they are today. But these kinds of things happen with forums,
The news. I mean, if anybody's interested in it's the 17th, the Burney 17th and 18th century newspapers collection. So it's a big Gale database, and you can get that through the RNCM, digital resources, and that's an incredibly useful resource. But you don't have to read many newspapers from the 1720s to just see more and more of the print space is devoted to the South Sea Bubble. I mean, it was just hysterical. It was almost a deliberate whipping up of, they call it mania. It's a bit like the tulip bulb mania in Holland. It's the same sort of thing. So she's not the only person to get a mention of that kind. But I don't know. What I don't know, because I say I'm not really very. I find dealing with monetary matters quite taxing. I don't know whether anybody made that kind of money. It would be interesting to know, but it really was a staggering amount, I think. It was really like the Euro lottery, multi-million, So I think at the very least it was probably wildly exaggerated.
Can I have one more? The will, you mentioned the handwriting, you said it wasn't ever so strong. But and you would know because you have looked at, so many documents from this period. But to me, I've not seen many. It was actually very legible, and I sort of, I wondered.
No, I think think what I said, or I hope I said, Adam, I might have said it wrongly. I would say that the penmanship was strong and confident.
Yeah.
What I said was that the third codicil, which she wrote in her last illness, it's still legible, but it looks more hurried and a bit shakier than the earlier ones. But no, I would say it's well written. I mean, I haven't looked at loads either, but there's a lot fewer crossings out in this. So I get the feeling, and it's long. I mean, it's substantial. It's longer than a lot of wills from this period. So you get the feeling that, you know, she'd perhaps done a rough copy and then did a fair copy. It's certainly, it's careful, and it's very literate and literary. The literary style is very confident, I think.
That was my sense of, you know, that made it even more interesting that the spellings were so kind of wild. And so, yeah, I think you're absolutely right with your interpretation of that. It's really fascinating.
I don't know if anybody has any, you know, if you want to share with me at some point any thoughts about whether it would be reasonable from the evidence of the will and what we know about her family background that she probably was brought up in France. I mean, there's certainly no baptism records for her that I've been able to find here. I have looked or had kind volunteers looking in France, but because we don't know which part of France, you know, necessarily we're looking for, we've not managed to find any evidence of baptism. But I'm sure she was born in 1694 or thereabouts.
Where would the name Jane have come from then, if she was born in France?
Well, she actually calls herself in the will Jeanne, Jeanne.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just thinking. So, yes, that could be a very good clue, but then there are instances where people use other names all the time and never actually use the name that they were born with in this period,
Yeah.
in this field. I think time will allow me to ask one question, if that's okay. Nobody has any pressing questions? Okay. So one thing I find so fascinating about this work is that it makes what are otherwise perhaps fleeting references in literature at that time, it makes it so personal. And I like you, I think you said you were moved by reading the last one. I found myself getting a bit emotional, somebody dictating or writing out actually the last wishes on earth, and you know, romantic liaisons and all these things that make it so interesting. But what I find particularly interesting about Barbier's life is that so much of it seems to change the perspective of the conception of females on the stage at this time. That they would often be mistresses who are financially dependent on others. I've seen some really, really terrible handwriting from people who spent their entire lives on the stage. And this goes back to what you're saying about why it's so important to see the original if possible, because so much can be learned from that. And like you say, language spellings weren't standardized, nor was education, but someone to be able to write that clearly at that age is really remarkable for people, I think, overall who were in the theatre, especially with, as you said, I think the stigma around people on stage, especially women who were thought of in not great ways. And I wonder, do you get a sense from, as you're putting this puzzle together, that the more we learn about this particular individual and then others like her, it might actually change that narrative at all? Or do you think that this is the exception that proves the rule? She was, as you saw, or as you showed us, wealthy, even if exaggerated, very wealthy, which, of course, at the time, performers on the stage, some were paid very well, but it was not the case always, but it seems like here, yes, there's something exceptional about her. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
I was just trying to think about other people that I've written about. So I'm thinking about people like Caterina Galli, slightly later, but an Italian young woman who came at 17 or something, again, over to live and work in London. remained unmarried, made a very good living for herself, but didn't manage her money very judiciously, shall we say. I mean, it's interesting that these women singers were in a bit of a privileged position in that they were able to earn money independently and sustain themselves in often quite a good lifestyle. So I don't think she was that unusual. As I mentioned, there are loads of examples of people who are actually better paid than she was, who ended up, you know, in real dire poverty. Absolutely having to go cap in hand for, you know, any parish handouts that were possible. So I think to have a woman who had looked after her own money as effectively as Barbier seems to do, she obviously had a lot of agency. And it's the bigger picture is a difficult one, isn't it, to know, because I get so involved with these individual lives that sometimes I can't step back and see the bigger picture. But I think, you know, she's interesting, and I think she's unusual, but I certainly don't think that she's unique. And bearing in mind that she was, I mean, she's interesting because she moved from the opera house to the playhouse. That was, and again, I think it was at the time when, because Italian opera was becoming very popular, the audience wanted Italian singers, and she wasn't an Italian singer. And I suspect that's why she moved out to the playhouses.
Do you think it could have had to do, I don't know at what point, I forget, but physiological, just the singing voice wasn't quite there anymore.
Possibly.
Step back from that.
But I mean, she certainly must be good. I mean, a lot of the roles that the castrato Valentini sang initially, she then went on and sung his roles in revivals. And I mean, I haven't, you know, by no means have looked at all of the music, but I've looked at some of it, and it's not an easy repertoire. So she must have been very capable. I'd love to know where she studied. Quite possibly in Italy, actually, but because she just appears suddenly in the Queen's Theatre, you know. She sort of started at the top, so to speak.
Okay, well, if there's no other pressing questions, I think at this point, we can continue the conversation outside, of course, as well we should. But before we do that, please join me in thanking Cheryl.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. And thanks to Austin for operating the PowerPoint seamlessly.